Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. And welcome especially to the very first program of our busy winter season in 2011. I know it was a snowy night, and of course I came a lot farther than you did, or most of you anyway, to be here tonight, and it was snowy. The minute you hit Portland, you get the snow showers. Predicted or not, that's the sort of the snow line over on this side of the state. But we're glad that you made the effort to be here, and we know that you won't be disappointed. It is most appropriate for us to begin our busy season with a program featuring our primary and longstanding partner, and that is the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley, and of course their esteemed director, Gleaves Whitney. To introduce our speaker, it is my pleasure to introduce Carol Van Andel, the chair of the executive board of the Hauenstein Center. And before Carol comes up to the podium, would you please attend to a matter of housekeeping, which is, would you please turn off your cell phones and other devices that might interrupt our program. Carol, over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here tonight. It's a real pleasure, and no, I did not get this tan here. I thought I'd just answer your question. You're all thinking that. It is my pleasure to introduce Gleaves Whitney tonight. Gleaves, he has brought national attention to Grand Valley State's Hauenstein Center, and he has helped West Michigan to gain attention as a serious center of President scholarship. But one of his most favorite accomplishments to me is that he has helped to extend Ralph Hauenstein's legacy of leadership and service. For those of you who know Ralph and who love him, I don't think you love him as much as I do. Gleaves and I might argue about that. But it is so gratifying to see a gift that was given by Ralph Hauenstein, who has dedicated his entire life to giving back not only to his country, but to this state. And the Hauenstein Center that Gleaves has brought to national attention certainly fulfills that principle. Gleaves Whitney became director of Grand Valley State University Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies in 2003. During his tenure, he has organized more than 300 public programs, including 4 national conferences covered by C-SPAN and 3 internationally cast webcast debates, one to more than 3,500 viewers in 18 countries, and another watched on YouTube by more than 112,000. He has overseen tremendous growth of the Hauenstein Center's website, premiered a popular web column called Ask Gleaves, the first presidential Q&A column in the nation, and created a leadership academy for students and young professionals committed to public service, one that is near and dear to my heart. In addition to his public work, Gleaves is a scholar who writes and lectures nationally on a variety of historical topics. As director of the Hauenstein Center, he is recently recognized by the Michigan Council for the social studies of an outstanding mentor, and was awarded its prestigious Mal Miller Mentoring Award for 2009. Phew. Please join me in welcoming Gleaves Whitney.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Well, thank you so much, Carol, for that very warm introduction. We are really pleased to have such a close association, because what Carol didn't say is that she goes way back with Ralph. And when you have lunch with the two of them and watch how they interact with each other, it's a real charge. They were fishing together years ago and had all kinds of experiences. So when we have Carol on our board, our executive board, you're really getting the real thing, somebody who understands Ralph's mission and somebody who's also fiercely dedicated to extending his legacy of leadership and service. So Carol, we thank you very much for your role at the Hauenstein Center. I also want to take a moment just to thank Elaine Didier. Thank you for your opening comments, and also Joe Calvaruzzo. You know, the three of us have been able to forge a partnership here with the Hauenstein Center and the Ford Presidential Museum and the Ford Foundation. I think it's a partnership that's second to none in the nation, where you have a Presidential Studies Center and a NARA facility such as this one. We're very proud of the programs that we're able to bring to West Michigan. But it takes some great leadership on this side of the street. So Elaine and Joe, thank you so much for all you do in that regard. You know, I'm really proud to be associated with the brand, the name on the other side of this podium. And obviously, it is such an honor to direct the Presidential Studies Center in Ralph Hauenstein's name. When I spoke to him earlier today, he said to tell you that he was sorry that he couldn't be here with us tonight. Then he said, "What's the weather like up there?" I told him the weather, gave him a little report, and he said, "I guess I'm not that sorry." See, he's right now where these plants grow year-round, and he's really enjoying that very much. Let me give you a little Ralph update here. You know, he's just amazing as an individual. He's about to turn 99 years old on March 20th. 99 years old. And all of you, of course, see him around town. Remarkable individual. When he was about to turn 97 years old, people would come up, you know, we'd be having lunch or something. People would come up to him and they would say, "Ralph, how have you made it so long in such good shape?" And he said, "Well, it's really a simple program. I avoid stress, disappointment, anger, frustration. I don't play golf." Then when he turned 98, he turns 98 and people are saying, "Man, you're looking so great. How do you do it? What's your secret?" He says, "It's really very simple. I won't eat organic food." Well, a reporter was recently with Ralph, and the reporter said, "You know, this is really remarkable. You're about to celebrate your 99th birthday now. And we're so interested in how you're doing. And, you know, you're really, Ralph, if you think about it, you're going to be in your 100th year. How are you going to celebrate?" And Ralph, with that quick laugh of his, he said, "Well, I guess I better start preparing for the next 100 years. We know what he really meant. He's an inspiration. So I'd like to say, Ralph, this talk's for you. I study leaders. I try to search out what it is in leaders through their traits, their virtues, their upbringing, their environment, their challenges. What is it that makes a few people among us really stand out? And this evening, I'd like to do something that's been on my mind a long time. I recognize a lot of faces in here from Ollie and from Grand Forum and other places, and you've heard bits of Churchill lectures, you've heard bits of Lincoln lectures, but I've never had the opportunity to bring these two massive subjects together. And I'd like to compare these two modern democratic statesmen whose deaths were separated by exactly 100 years. You know, Lincoln, of course, died in 1865, Churchill in 1965, almost on this day. It was actually January 24th. He'd had a stroke on January 10th, and then 2 weeks later he passed away. They do not make a natural pairing, these two. In some ways, they could hardly be more different. But that's instructive because, you see, it shows us the range of leadership that we can expect now in a democracy, especially when that democracy is under stress and its very survival is at stake. I'd like to begin in the spirit of Plutarch, greatest biographer of the ancient world, who always paired two lives to draw out the distinctions, the similarities, the differences, the lessons that we can draw from looking at those things, to get a better picture of Lincoln and Churchill, and especially their inner life. Okay, let's start with their ancestry. Their ancestry was quite different. Lincoln's British ancestry was populated by commoners, rabble to the government in London. Today they may be, I think they'd be called white trash. These simple folk were encouraged to leave the pretty green hills of England and take up a strenuous life in the colonies. And over the generation, this white trash morphed into the rough-hewn frontiersmen who would build an empire, a transcontinental empire from sea to sea. Churchill, by contrast, came into the world with a gilded pedigree, the child of America's upper class and England's upper crust. His most famous ancestor, of course, was Sir John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, whose victory at Blenheim helped establish a transoceanic British empire on which the sun never set. The circumstances of their birth was quite different. Lincoln was born, as you know, in a dirt floor log cabin that measured 16 by 20. That's all it was, in the Valley of Democracy. Another word for the Ohio River Basin. Churchill, by contrast, was born in the marble-floored Baroque palace spanning 175,000 square feet. Blenheim Palace, if you've been there, it's just outside of Oxford, the heart of old England amid the fine houses and horses and hounds of the aristocracy. Churchill always said that one of the two most important decisions he ever made was to be born at Blenheim Palace. The other great decision he made at Blenheim was to ask Clementine Hosier to marry him. So he thought Blenheim was good luck to him. Their appearance was so different. Lincoln grew to a lanky 6'4", weighed about 180 pounds. Matthew Brady's black and white photographs show that great shock of black hair and then the beard that he sported starting in the 1860 presidential campaign. He knew that he was not one of the beautiful people of his day, so he developed self-deprecating humor as a defense. When Stephen Douglas accused Lincoln of having two faces in one of the famous debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln looked at him and he said, "My dear sir, if I had two faces, would I ever wear this one in public?" Churchill, by contrast, stood only 5'6" tall. He was about 215 pounds most of his adult life. The grainy newsreels that we see of him show a balding pate with wispy hair. Once when he went to a barber and asked for a haircut, the barber was trying to be very polite, and he said, "What kind of style would you like?" Churchill looked at him, scoffed. He said, "Style?" He said, "A man with hair my thin doesn't have style, just cut." Their education was so different. Lincoln called his formal schooling deficient. In the lonely forests of the Kentucky-Indiana frontier, it amounted to all of 1 year at a passel of ABC schools where he learned to read, write, and reckon to the rule of 3. But he read anything he could get his hands on. He read the Bible, he read Shakespeare, Aesop, Burns' poetry. He read the law, always read deeply in the law. And you know those compilations of the law, they're not just the laws that have just been passed. The compilations of the law, pick up a book even to this day, always have Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles, the Constitution. He read deeply in those. Churchill was, by contrast, raised in the typical blue blood manner. He was initially brought up by a nanny. Then he was sent off to boarding school at the age of 7, then on to Harrow, and then on to Sandhurst. A fine pedigree indeed. Ironically, until he got to Sandhurst, Churchill did poorly in just about everything that he did in school. In fact, his teachers pretty much wrote him off, and they said that he was one of the naughtiest boys they'd ever known. Nevertheless, he dedicated himself to a program of reading history and English literature that was second to none. This passion for reading the great cadences of our language would find themselves in the nearly 20 million words that he would compose as an adult. 10 million of those words just in that period in the wilderness years in the 1930s. Late in life, when Churchill had amassed honorary doctorates from around the world, he quipped, "As life has unfolded, I've been astonished to find how many more degrees I've received than examinations I ever passed." Now, mention of school years brings me to a bit of an off-color story. You guys won't mind, will you? Can't do Churchill without doing some of the off-color stories. Well, Once a man in a men's room was very disapproving of Churchill after he finished at the latrine. And the man was a little snooty, and he sort of raised his nose up and he said, "At Eton, we learned to wash our hands after using the latrine." And Churchill shot back. He said, "Well, at Harrow, we learned not to piss on our hands." Which reminds me of another off-color latrine story, and we could go on all night with these, but I'm just going to tell you one more. This is one of Ralph's favorites. That's why I'm including it tonight. Clement Attlee, who defeated Churchill in 1945, was a strong proponent of government intervention in the economy, in private industry of all types, and this policy that Churchill opposed. And when Churchill met Attlee in the House of Commons men's room one day, Churchill took the urinal farthest away from Attlee. And Attlee said, "Are you feeling a bit standoffish today, Winston?" And Churchill replied, "When you socialists see something big, you rush to nationalize it." Even I'm turning red. And Ralph always loves this follow-up punchline. I want to get it just right. It was this encounter in the latrine that's what's behind Churchill's famous characterization of Attlee as a modest man with much to be modest about. Okay, let's get away from the latrine stories, get back to some serious material here. Let's look at their social status. Quite different. Lincoln's intense childhood poverty and his rustic frontier upbringing made him socially awkward his entire life. This is one of the reasons he married Mary, because she was considered upper crust from Lexington, and she brought that more sophisticated quality to and that ambition to the marriage. At one extreme, Lincoln was embarrassed by his cracker relatives and the dirt farmer background of his family. At the other extreme, he detested silk stocking pretension in all its forms, especially the plantation Democrats of his day. At the height of his career there in Springfield, successful lawyer representing the multinational corporations of the day, the railroads, this successful lawyer had a comfortable but not a pretentious house. At most, they had one or two servants to help Mary. Now contrast this with Churchill. Churchill trumpeted his aristocratic background. He wrote a 2-volume biography of his father. He wrote a 4-volume biography of the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill. And throughout his adult years, he maintained a lavish lifestyle. You know, you see the newsreels, him and Onassis out on the yacht in the Mediterranean so many times. He went to the south of France 2 or 3 times a year. It's one of the reasons he always was hustling for money by writing books and going out on the lecture circuit. His capacious old house there, Chartwell, required a minimum of 12 servants. Their personal habits were different. Lincoln rose with the sun. He didn't drink. He was a teetotaler, which is unusual on the frontier in that time. And he didn't smoke. Had nothing to do with tobacco products. Well, Churchill, quite a different story. Churchill woke up at 8 to be sure. He'd take his little mask off, his little silk mask off, so that he'd finally see light. You see, he was going to determine when he was going to see light, not the sun. And he began by reading papers, and you know the British system, the British get their mail first thing in the morning, so he would go through his mail as well. And he wouldn't get out of his bed until almost noon, when he'd splash around the tub and water would go everywhere. But he drank prodigiously, 9 manly scotches a day. That's not including the port, the wine, the champagne that he also drank with lunch and with dinner. And have you ever seen a candid shot of Churchill without a stogie? He smoked 9 cigars a day as well. 9 of those. Well, usually Churchill held his liquor well, but he could have an acerbic tongue by the end of the day if you crossed him. In one famous encounter, Bessie Braddock said to Churchill, "Sir, you are drunk." And he replied, "And you, madame, are ugly. At least I will be sober in the morning." Another famous exchange occurred when Lady Nancy Astor said, "Winston, if I were your wife, I'd poison you. Nancy, if I were your husband, I should drink it." One did not want to get in a verbal duel with this man. Their war experiences were very different. At 23 years of age, Lincoln became a captain in the Black Hawk War, but he never saw combat. By his own confession, the only blood he saw in the Black Hawk War was from swatting mosquitoes. How ironic, given that he would be the commander-in-chief of the war that would take more American lives, 626,000, than all other American wars combined. Churchill was a war hero by his 25th birthday. Go back to the Boer War, South Africa, and he's in this convoy, he's in a train, a lot of soldiers in there. He's technically an embedded reporter, one of the first embedded reporters, but he's also an officer. And the train gets ambushed, and he's uninjured, so he's the one who's able to pull a lot of the injured out, and he removes them to safety, and he goes back. He keeps going back, and the valor is apparent, and it's going to be written about. It's one of the first things famous that will be said about him. And he's running up and down the line. He's organizing other people to remove the injured by saying, "Be men," and he's fearlessly exposing himself. Well, then he's taken prisoner. Well, do you think you can keep Churchill in a prison long? He manages to escape. He hides in a mine, and he escapes by dressing as a woman and is able to find his way to safety. And this made the 25-year-old swashbuckler a modern Prince Charlie, as one headline put it. Churchill also, as you know, became First Lord of the Admiralty, World War I, the beginning of World War II as well, before he became Prime Minister 8.5 months after the outbreak of the Second World War, the most devastating conflict in human history with more than 60 million deaths. These two individuals knew something about war. Now, while these two leaders could hardly be more different in some of the ways that we've just talked about, they shared a number of traits. And this is instructive too. It's striking, their similarities. In their youth, they did not inspire the confidence of their peers. Neither one of them would have come out of high school being voted most likely to succeed. Their religious outlook was so unorthodox. Neither one of them was a confessional Christian. Neither one of them seemed to pray except toward the very end of their lives, but through the height of their public career, not praying men particularly. Both mastered English to such a degree that their words became treasures in our literary anthologies. Both these wartime leaders were tender-hearted. Oh, were they tender-hearted. This is one of the most surprising things I learned as I kept reading about them. There's a story of Lincoln, for example, as a boy, and he wants to man up on the frontier. He wants to try to please his father. We're going to get into this difficult relationship with his father here in a minute, but he sees a turkey crossing the garden, and so he takes out a rifle and he shoots the turkey. He felt so bad about shooting the turkey that he vowed he would never hunt large game again, or anything larger than, a rabbit. Churchill was also very tender-hearted. He built these lakes at Chartwell, and he stocked the lakes with his favorite goldfish, and he had a number of geese and ducks, and he named them all. And if there were little ducklings, he would be so interested to make sure that all of them were surviving and all of them were fine. He would pick them up and hold them and stroke them and call them my darling and all of this. He had names for every one of them. And he also had this little poodle named Rufus. It followed him everywhere. And when he was conducting his business there at Chartwell, Rufus was always there. Well, my favorite story about Rufus is one day Churchill is on the line with an important minister, and Rufus is starting to get all tangled up in the phone line. And so Churchill yells at Rufus, he's on the phone, "Get off the line, you damn fool!" And of course, The minister hangs up immediately, and Churchill has to call him back and say, "No, I didn't mean you. It was my little poodle that was on that line." Both these men had a tough time finding a woman who would marry them. Both had challenging marriages. Both lost young children. Both spent long years out of the limelight until a national crisis riveted their attention, grabbed their energies. For Lincoln, as you know, the national crisis was the spread of slavery into the Western territories. For Churchill, it was a civilizational crisis. You can read this in his speeches in 1940, where Churchill is laying it on the line. If we do not stand firm against the Nazis, we go down, maybe Western civilization goes down, and we will be, Western people will be run by race ideology. So a lot is at stake, which engages these men and brings them back into the limelight. Both of these men were attacked physically in the presence of their wives. Not very many people are aware that Churchill was pushed by a suffragette. She tried to get to him and push him in front of an oncoming train. And Clemmy actually, was warding her off with an umbrella. We all know what happened in Ford's Theater in April 1865 when an actor's bullet found its mark. Finally, both, as leaders, had the capacity to make tough decisions, and so it is no surprise that these two leaders really became reviled for many of the decisions that they made. Abraham Lincoln has been viewed by a vocal minority of Americans to this day as a tyrant because of his interpretation of the Constitution and because of the way he prosecuted the war. And there's an African connection to this criticism. He personally profited from the sale of slaves. He actually represented a slaver in a case against a slave. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free any of the slaves that Lincoln actually had the capacity to free in 1863. And by today's standards, he'd be considered a racist. He did not want freed black men and women to be integrated in American society. He preferred that they go to Liberia and recolonize Africa. All these factors, critics say, cast a lot of doubt on Lincoln's reputation as the great emancipator. Winston Churchill was also reviled by many over the course of his long career, still is. Alternately hated by organized labor, suffragettes, the Irish, the French. Oh, the French. That tragedy at Oran, where in French North Africa, Churchill had to make the decision to sink the French fleet. And over 1,200 French sailors went to their deaths. 24 hours before, they'd been our allies. Of course, the Brits who lost loved ones in the disastrous Dardanelles campaign, and people everywhere who were colonized by the British had their issues with Churchill. Also because Churchill is one of the architects of the Palestine Mandate of 1923. He's viewed as having really been the author of a lot of problems that persist to this day. If any of you have sent young men and women to Iraq, there's been some work out there which blames Churchill. There's an African connection for him too. Recently, the Churchill bust that sat in the Oval Office was packed up and shipped out because President Obama's grandfather back in Kenya during the Mau Mau Revolution had been tortured and imprisoned by the British. So President Obama did not want to have a visible symbol of Churchill in the Oval Office. But on a lighter note, let's not forget that Churchill took criticism in stride, as he sanguinely put it. History will be kind to me, for I shall write it. Okay, none of the foregoing parallels, none of them, none of the contrasts I've drawn, really, it seems to me, get at the essence of what made these two individuals great. If you're looking to put these two individuals in the company of the greatest 100 human beings who've ever been on earth, I would argue that it was their inner strength, their exceptional psychological resilience, and their courage to persevere. And for the remainder of our time together, I'd like to focus on this most significant trait of their inner strength. What perennially intrigues people about Abraham Lincoln, let's start with him, is how this man became a great leader. It's a riveting question because of how humbly he started and how high he rose in such a relatively brief time. Russell Kirk puts it this way, quote, Lincoln was a man who, until late in his life, seemed thoroughly unlikely ever to be a leader of opinion or of party, let alone a statesman. We see him only 3 years before he won the presidential election, still an obscure and gawky Western lawyer, attending court in Cincinnati in his rumpled clothes, snubbed by Stanton and the other distinguished lawyers. The man still seemed pathetic at best, if not downright ludicrous. All the majesty and loneliness of his tragedy was yet to come. Close quote. I like to put Lincoln's his meteoric rise in the context of something that Booker T. Washington said in 1899 in this famous speech on the great emancipator. Booker T. Washington said, the proper measure of a man is not the accolades he receives, the diplomas on the wall, it's the obstacles he overcomes in the course of his life to achieve anything that he actually is able to do. And by that measure, Abraham Lincoln overcame more obstacles than any other president who's been in the White House. He overcame geographic isolation on the frontier. He overcame that hard-scrabble poverty of his youth. He overcame the lack of formal schooling, the lack of scholarly credentials. He overcame his family's lack of inheritable wealth. He overcame the lack of political connections in his family. He overcame the fact that he was neither handsome nor athletic nor charismatic in the sense that we expect our politicians to be today. He overcame losing jobs and losing elections, not once, not twice, but again and again and again. Isolated, poor, unschooled, without connections or good looks or a winning track record. What a great resume to run for president. Yet the biggest liability he overcame was what Michael Burlingame called emotional poverty. Early in life, he had to cope with a cascading succession of tragedies. And I think it was having to deal and grieve through these tragedies that built in him that unconquerable spirit. You know, they say it's the pain that you feel that makes you, when you work through that pain, is what makes you tougher and stronger. His only natural brother died early. His mother died an agonizing death of milk sickness. If you talk to doctors and find out what it's like to die over a week period of time of this sickness, it's dreadful. There he is cooped up in a cabin with her, watching her, an 8-year-old boy, watching his mother waste away. He had to help his dad, in fact, make her coffin. The sister he was close to died after she gave birth. Then, when he was in his mid-20s, his first love, the love of his life, Anne Rutledge, died. There was also another terrible scene where he has to go in and say goodbye to her. These are heart-rending scenes. With all those deaths, you'd hope that Lincoln then would draw close to his father. Not so. The father and the son were alienated from each other from the get-go. Young Abe was not like other boys on the frontier. He didn't like to hunt, didn't like to fight, didn't like to farm. What he liked to do was read and think. Read and think. His father thought his son was lazy. His father would beat the son when he didn't do all of his chores. The boys would sometimes, have to hide from his father. He didn't fit into the frontier life or his father's expectations, so he was estranged. In fact, he did not even go to his father's deathbed and funeral. Now, given all this emotional poverty, Lincoln was prone to severe depression, what they called in the 19th century melancholy. Melancholia. The melancholy was once so bad that Lincoln went fetal. He could not even get out of bed. This was after Anne Rutledge had died. In fact, when a storm came over and the rain fell, Lincoln got out of bed, went to the grave, and threw himself physically on the grave, on the mud, because he could not stand the thought of the rainwater reaching her body. At that point, his best friend, Joshua Speed, was so worried about Lincoln that he took the knives, razors, anything that Lincoln could have hurt himself with, and hid them. Now, given all this loss, Lincoln had to develop inner strength, that psychological resilience to deal with the grief. Perhaps it accounts for why he was always wise beyond his years. You know, Sophocles, the ancient playwright, said, "We only learn when we suffer." More than 2,500 years ago, the Greeks created their archetypal hero out of Odysseus, a man who made an impossibly difficult journey. Maybe the possibilities of the American Odyssey are best illustrated in our prairie hero, Abraham Lincoln. My good colleague Brian Flanagan likes to point out Lincoln grew into a kind of mythic figure by passing test after test after test. His triumphs in 1860, in 1864, and 1865 owed much to the emotional strength long forged in the crucible of hardship and defeat. Lincoln earns a place in the history books because he was commander-in-chief during the greatest trial our nation ever faced. He earns a spot in the pantheon of great presidents because of the courage he showed in office. He earns a cradle in our hearts because of his character even in its vulnerability, that inspires us and gives us strength. We look to our American Odysseus, at Abraham Lincoln's remarkable odyssey from log cabin to White House. And think, what an example for us all. If he could overcome the obstacles he did and get to the White House, maybe we can fulfill our potential. If he could achieve the task appointed him by history, there is hope for each of us. And the American dream can never die so long as we know Abraham Lincoln's Odyssey. Now, let me complete this little study in the name of Plutarch's Parallel Lives by looking at the most important element in Churchill's leadership, his lion-hearted courage, his courage to deal with demons inside and out. What makes biography a good read is to see how people handle adversity. As a historian, I always like to take a snapshot of a subject, of a leader, and see if you were to take that snapshot and ask, will this person at this point in life become a great leader? What are the odds? I especially like to take that snapshot and tell students about that snapshot when it looks like there's not a chance for that person to become what they're about to develop into. That's the beauty of history. And those of you who have heard my talks on Washington and Gandhi and Eisenhower, I've used this technique many times. Oh, and also on U.S. Grant. Regarding Churchill, we can point to several times when we might take a snapshot and just say, he's finished. Stick a fork in it. Consider his childhood when he mostly had to deal with his inner demons. If we were to take a snapshot of Churchill when, say, he was about 16 years old, we would encounter a deeply troubled boy who spoke with a lisp. A point referenced in the blockbuster movie that you've no doubt seen, The King's Speech. He had been written off by his father. Yes, written off. As somebody who would never amount to anything, and worse, emotionally neglected by both his father and his mother. Oh, the letters that he writes from boarding school. They are so poignant. The letters, they'll say, "Dear Mummy, please, 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 come see me." Oh, it tears your heart out to see these letters. The lack of emotional support from his parents caused deep psychological wounds that would haunt Churchill for the rest of his life. Well, one way Churchill salved these deep wounds was by pursuing worldly ambition. If he couldn't be loved, he would be admired. It's actually not a bad strategy for somebody who's had a kind of a rough childhood. And by his 27th birthday, Churchill had distinguished himself in a staggering number of arenas. At Sandhurst, on the battlefield, as a daring-do war correspondent, as a best-selling author, as a self-made millionaire as a result of his writing. as a member of Parliament. Now, these are accomplishments that hardly anybody attains, much less in the first few years of adulthood. It must be said the salve of success was only partly successful in suppressing his demons. His granddaughter, Celia Sandys, observed that all the accolades, all the adulation, the reverence even that Churchill received in later years never made up for that little boy in him, what he really craved, which was, quote, for his father to look down and to know that the son, whom he always said would be a failure, had actually been a success. Well, it's not just when he was young that it seemed Churchill wouldn't amount to much. If they were take a snapshot of him when he was about 42 years old, after the disastrous Dardanelles campaign, we would hear Churchill say in his own words, I am ruined by my own poor judgment. He would be finished off by his inner demon of despair and the outer demon of a ruined reputation. After all, more than 100,000 British soldiers and sailors died in that campaign in vain. To Clemmy, it was doubtful whether he could ever recover from such a grievous mistake. But he showed uncommon resilience, again, against these demons. He did two things. After the Dardanelles, he left the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he volunteered to fight on the Western Front. I want you to think about that. I'm going to say that again. He leaves the office, and he goes to the mud of Flanders on the Western Front as a lieutenant colonel. And he doesn't stand behind the lines. He gets in the trenches. He is with the men who are making the charges in that inferno called no man's land, where they fight over 100 yards of turf and thousands die for it. It seemed the right thing to do after the sacrifice he had asked of so many others. Another way he showed resilience after the Dardanelles, Henry Matthews is going to love this one, he became a painter. He became a painter after his 40th birthday, and he would go on to paint some 520 canvases. And we're not talking about real amateur efforts here. We're talking about somebody who was eventually in the Tate Museum, in galleries in Paris. Picasso said this is a man who could have made his living as a painter. Sir Kenneth Clark said this is the best so-called amateur I have ever seen. This was an accomplished painter. Beautiful, expressive paintings, bold colors that express that ebullient spirit of his. You know, because he took up painting after his 40th birthday, I think he'd be the perfect poster child for AARP. There were other times when Churchill's career was poised to fall off a cliff. If we took a snapshot of him in his mid-50s now, in the so-called wilderness years, we would see one midlife report card offered by Victor Wallace Germains, who wrote a book titled The Tragedy of Winston Churchill. Comes out in 1931. It's available. I checked on Amazon.com this morning. There's a copy on Amazon.com that's available for $250. Don't buy it. It's not worth it. This ad hominem holds Churchill up as an object lesson in everything a public servant should not be. His career, which had begun with such promise, such a pedigree, had been stalked by repeated failure, both inside the cabinet and out, again due to overarching ambition and poor judgment. He hardly seemed a worthy descendant of John Churchill. Well, who got the last laugh? 8 years later, of course, Churchill is leading his plucky people to victory against the most fearsome war machine ever visited on the earth. Where does this resilience come from, this lion-hearted courage? I think Churchill was able to fight outer demons like Hitler because he'd had so much practice wrestling with inner demons, what he called his black dog, his famous allusion to his depression. Throughout life, he seemed able to parlay his depression into vigorous action. Psychologists tell us this is not uncommon for great leaders. Psychologists have long known that depression can act as a spur to those of a certain temperament and native ability. Aware of how low they will sink at times, they propel themselves into activity and achievements the rest of us regard with awe. Well, Churchill does indeed all those of us who come under his spell. He earns a place in the history books because he helped save Western civilization. He earns a spot in the pantheon of great prime ministers because of his refusal to negotiate a separate peace with Hitler. And he earns a cent in our heart because his lion-hearted courage inspired his people and gave them strength during their most desperate hour. There are many speeches that I could quote from at this point in Churchill's words. But the one that strikes me as the most fitting is among the shortest. The setting is the fall of 1941. Pearl Harbor hasn't happened yet. The United States has not yet thrown its immense war resources, materiel, into this war. In the West, Britain feels pretty much alone against the Wehrmacht, fighting it out. The Battle of Britain is over, it's true, but there's not much free land in Western Europe. Returning to Harrow to listen to some traditional songs he had learned as a youth, Churchill was asked to say a few words to the boys. Churchill told them, never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never give in. Those words reveal a man determined to wrestle his inner demon of despair to the ground and kick the outer demon of war into surrender. I wouldn't be surprised if those words acted as Churchill's mantra. If you visit in London there, the dark underground war rooms, you get a feel for what it was like living under there and the despair that somebody could feel looking at that big map by where he slept and watching the Wehrmacht go virtually unopposed through much of Europe. But he had that mantra, never give in. Churchill believed he was the man appointed by history to face down Hitler and to save his people, and he did it. Against all odds, this man did it. I began this talk by telling you that I study leaders. I try to search out their traits, their virtues. I look at their background. I look at the context historically in which they have the opportunity to prove their mettle. What is it about these people who become exceptional in the human condition? You know, there's scores of explanations about what leadership is, what makes certain people rise to the top. But I think what made Lincoln and Churchill great is their inner strength. Their uncommon emotional resilience and courage sustained them during their darkest trials. And because they were so gifted with language, they were able to translate that strength into the language of every man and thus give their nations hope. Now, isn't that what is required in a democracy, in a place where there's rule by the many? Democracy requires citizens to be as strong as their leaders. Now, since the Second World War, we have enjoyed a long run of relative peace and prosperity. No worldwide conflagration has required us to sacrifice the way Ralph Hauenstein's generation had to sacrifice between 1939 and 1945. But it's not the end of history. Hard times come to democracies. Citizens need leaders who are strong. But whether you identify yourself with the party of innovation or the party of conservation, we the people also need to be strong. I think we will be okay if we always tell the rising generation the stories of Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and leaders like them. Okay, class, time for questions. Yes, it will. And I want you to be able to quote verbatim the speech that I read you. Bill.
Just give us a brief outline. Churchill became Prime Minister after the evacuation of Dunkirk. Just tell us a little bit about how he became, how that involved with
Well, the Prime Minister to that point, Neville Chamberlain, had a difficult time with the, from Munich forward, there had been a growing awareness that he, and I don't want to just use the word appeaser because it's thrown around so carelessly nowadays, but he was known as the original appeaser in this sense. He did not act with the strength, the vigor that was required at that moment. He did not understand that Hitler was dead serious about taking advantage of any weakness in the West. So when the German army, the Wehrmacht, starts to move west and takes over France, the British are trapped in this small area, this geographic area called Dunkirk. And Churchill is not, he's just coming into his own. He's giving voice to the British people at this point, around May 20th, 1940. And he gives a great speech, really one of his first as Prime Minister, in which he says, we're going to get you back home. We're going to resist from our small isle, and we're going to stand up to these Nazis, and we're not going to lose. This was the amazing thing. When Churchill first becomes Prime Minister, virtually everybody in the world who's looking at the situation expects him to try to negotiate some kind of settlement with Hitler. So Churchill's first broadcast that goes out is defiant. He says, there will be no negotiation with the Nazis. We're not only going to not negotiate with them, we're not only going to hold our island, we are going to defeat them. And the reports that come back at Dunkirk from this, really, this maiden speech that's broadcast out there is so heartening for the soldiers, for the men, the Tommies out in the field. They said, we weren't expecting this. We weren't expecting a leader who said, we can win this thing. You see, he changed their mind. As I tell my students in class, material conditions are important, but once you change the mind of a person, so much happens. It's in the mind and in the heart. Churchill's communication, his leadership, was to change their mind from, that separate peace, that uncomfortable coexistence with the Nazis. What's our world going to look like? We're going to whip their ass. So by May 20th, 1940, yes, sir. That is a great question. The question is, who are the confidants? Who are the allies? And Lincoln was considered such a loner. He was considered the most private person, inscrutable. All of those jokes, all of that homespun country humor, this was really a facade. Now, he would make the point he would want it to make, but he would use the humor really as a great shield to keep people from penetrating and thinking about who he was. He really was. The Russell Kirk line, I think, puts it beautifully. They're alone in their tragedy. And both of them had this quality. I think they went within. But they also, obviously, they were surrounded by people all the time. And I think, Lincoln was funny in that he would distract himself sometimes by having inventors come in to the White House and show them the latest new weapon. And so he would get all caught up. He would draw inspiration, strength from constantly engaging with these folks who would come through. The White House was so different in those days because you'd have lines of visitors. They could walk into the downstairs. And so if he just went downstairs, he would run into the public, and he would have these conversations, and he was affable, but not always affable. You know, why don't we have a great movie about Lincoln? We don't have in our historic imagination a real clear picture of him, because he struck different people different ways. His sister-in-law thought he was the most cold, aloof man there ever was. His sister-in-law said the way he would pick at his food, he'd be absent-minded. He would pick at his food. He wasn't even aware of what he was eating. It was her impression. The impression of what it would be like when he would walk out into the streets of Springfield, and he'd walk there, you know, if you've done this in Springfield, Illinois, you know, it's only about 4 or 5 blocks from the house there to his law office, and neighbors would say hi to him, and he wouldn't even respond. This was a man who gave the impression he really was alone. Mary was not the confidant that he looked to. They had a rocky marriage. They had a supportive marriage also, but it could get very rocky, and she would become physically very agitated. We know the stories of, you know, her chasing him out in the yard with a weapon of some kind, something from the kitchen. There are these stories, somewhat apocryphal. So he really did not have a companion in his marriage for being a confidant. She also withdrew increasingly because of the tragedy she suffered. Mary gets a bad rap. You know, she was going to lose 3 of her 4 children, and the 4th committed her to an insane asylum. She had a tough life, too. Churchill, I think, very similar. Surrounded by people, you know, always engaged at parties. He had, if you look at the registry of guests coming through Chartwell, this was a great big personality, and he wanted to fill Chartwell with other big personalities. Every lunch, every dinner was this remarkable repartee with people. But in terms of your question, are people able to get into the inner man? I don't think so. And here's why. Did you notice the disconnect? I didn't have time to go into it. But did you notice the disconnect in my talk? Churchill thought what of his dad? He idolized him. He wrote 2 volumes about him. It's as though he compartmentalized his father. And yet, we know that his father, when the young boy is at school, we know his father will go through town and not bother to see his son. And so then young Winston will write one of these poignant letters, such as the one I told you about to his mom. Same kind of letter. You know, would you please come see me? The only time that it really stood out that the father and the mother came to see Churchill away at school is when he almost died of pneumonia. So it's so tragic. He was very alone in this tragedy and in this suffering. And what I think confounds historians is that after a great person dies, everybody is his best friend. Can you imagine the historiography out there, the literature that claims, and, you know, we were close? You have to filter out a lot of that nonsense. They're not that close. And they're pulling out stories, a lot of stories that don't have really any basis in reality. They're trying to make something of themselves. They were close to the great one, you know. But I don't think they had the confidants in the sense that we know. For example, President Obama has confidants. I mean, he's been very open about those confidants. Ronald Reagan did not have the close confidants who could really pierce the armor, apparently. There was something there. You walk up to him and there was an aloofness, a distance there. And maybe they did this to protect themselves from their own past and also to protect themselves from being too vulnerable to the public. Okay, Henry. Who's this now? Churchill. Yes, his children adored him. Again, very troubled relationships. I had to be really careful when I wrote these remarks not to make this a downer, because there's a lot of tragedy. They had one son, and I believe four or five daughters, 4 daughters, and one of the daughters dies early. A second daughter commits suicide. The son was a terrible disappointment because he was an alcoholic, and in his excessive drinking, Churchill, it just broke his heart to watch this mountain of talent erode right before his eyes, just erode. And Randolph dies shortly after his father does. So they knew that kind of pain, but the children apparently adored him. Churchill was very affectionate to the kids, and of course to have all of the animals there and sort of this big persona, there were a lot of games and hijinks and that kind of thing. He kept such an odd schedule. We haven't talked about that. William Manchester, I think, writes about this better than anybody else. But the schedule that Churchill keeps would not be conducive to having relations with your children that would be, very close. Churchill would stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning dictating, writing this 10 million words. He would have 2 secretaries taking everything down. Well, then he stayed in bed. So he only had brief periods during the afternoon and the evening where he could interact, but the children were very devoted to him. Okay, let's get from the perimeters. Yes? Well, the marriage between Clemmy and, yeah. Well, now this is an interesting marriage because Churchill, Winston and Clemmy wrote to each other often 1 or 2 notes a day, even when they were in the same house. It's true that Clemmy was very much a confidant. She could be very hard on Churchill. She usually picked at his faults. Especially if she observed the way he acted at a dinner, she would upbraid him for it. She'd write a little note and say, "You were beastly tonight. Don't act that way again. You're too boorish." So there was a strain in the relationship. However, they were very loyal to each other, and they came back very close together during the war. They absolutely needed each other. He needed her support and strength during the war. And the fact, if you look at their letters, if you actually physically look at the handwriting and all, you see affection come out in the most endearing ways, because Churchill would handwrite his little note to his wife, and then he would draw a little pig at the bottom, because he would be the pig. He said, "Cats look down on you, dogs look up at you, pigs just treat you as equals." And in later years, Churchill took to raising pigs, and he adopted them in the same way that he adopted the fish, the goldfish, the ducklings, and the geese. And Clemmy was always trying to turn those pigs into bacon. So it was a little bit of a tension there, but she would write him, and at the end of her sweet little notes, there'd be a cat. The pup kitten, it was very, very affectionate in that sense. But it was also a very difficult marriage. I mean, there was a lot of strain in it. Did you need more elaboration? Or they had separate bedrooms. In fact, he was only allowed in her bedroom if she wrote him a note and invited him. Is that the kind of detail you wanted, Don? How often was he able to get her to write? Okay, one more question. Yes, sir. There are noble leaders among the losers, absolutely. Let me answer it this way. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that they were great democratic leaders who helped, rally their country. No, in the sense when historians do surveys of the greatest democratic leaders, of course, little d, democratic leaders of all time, always on the list, besides Lincoln and Churchill, are Pericles of ancient Athens. Now, Pericles, if you've read Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles comes out on the losing end. Sparta wins that war. So there you have one leader who makes a terrible strategic blunder at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War by asking all the Athenians to leave their farms, come into the walls of Athens, and then the plague breaks out and wipes out the Athenians. And the war drags on and on and on. So sometimes losers who are considered great leaders, democratic leaders even, have a terrible record in that sense. But of course, we also remember Pericles for his building program and what makes it fun to visit Athens today, you know, to see the Parthenon and the Acropolis and so forth. So Bill Brands stood on this stage and he said something once that I think was very apt. He said, you know, presidential historians, people who study leadership, they're the ambulance chasers of the profession because you always go after the crisis. You look at the crisis. I mean, this is why, you know, the most of the leaders, Pericles was a wartime leader, Lincoln, Churchill, these are wartime leaders. FDR makes that same cut of the top wartime leaders. And who remembers really Grover Cleveland, who was a great president in a lot of ways. Grover Cleveland, yes, was a great president in a lot of ways, but we don't remember him because there wasn't a war. So yes, I think there's a grain of truth. And if you're in a war and you win that war, your stock as a leader goes way up. You've been a delightful audience. Thank you so much.